Ulak, good morning, everyone. I'm Heather Igloliorte. As Julie just said, I just want to make one correction. I'm not the only Inuit art historian. I'm the only one with a PhD, which is one form of training, but not the only form of training, obviously, for art historians. It's okay. I feel the love. I know what you mean. So today I'm going to talk about an exhibition, Sakkijajuk, which means to be visible. And it's an exhibition that's actually going to be here opening May long weekend. Please don't go to your cabins early. What's that? Oh, it's not May long weekend? Yes, never mind. May 25th, opening weekend, and a bunch of the artists that we're going to talk about today will be present at the opening and will be a part of a tour that happens on the Saturday after the Friday night opening, and we're going to bring in some throat singers and contemporary performances and have a dance party, and we would love for you to join us. There's going to be a whole bunch of Inuit and other Indigenous peoples there. So I'm going to talk about that exhibition, but first I want to talk a little bit. I was invited, Jarita mentioned to me that I should also talk a little bit about how I became an academic, and so I will tell you, I want to subtitle my talk, How the Game of Life Changed My Life, and I'll explain. So I am from Nunatsiavut. I'm actually from, so this is northern Labrador, of course. I actually grew up in the little town Happy Valley Goose Bay, but I'm Inuit on my father's side. On my mother's side, I'm a Newfoundlander, and that accounts for my sort of mixed up East Coast accent. And my father grew up in Hopedale, and his parents were from Hopedale and Nain. They are Igloliortes and Mitsuks. I won't do too much of that. Just to situate us in the cicumpolar world, Nunatsiavut is the most southerly Inuit population in the world. Of course, it goes Nunatsiavut, Nunavik in northern Quebec, Nunavut, then the Inuvialuit region, Inupiat and Yupik in Alaska, Siberian and Yupik on the Russian side, and Kalalit, which is in Greenland, and then there are Sami peoples in the Arctic as well. And then in Canada, it goes from west to east, the Inuvialuit settlement region, Nunavik, Nunavut, and Nunatsiavut. And you can see we're the smallest. We also have a very small population. So I started my career as an artist. I went to art school. I went to NASCAD. This is the only slide I have. I fortunately don't have any pictures of myself from my period. I had a shaved head for a little while, and I would put glitter on my skull on really special occasions. I was like extra art school. So I left Labrador and moved to Nova Scotia to study. I actually started and did 3 years of a painting degree and of a jewelry degree, and then had kind of a crisis in the middle of my degree and just found that the processes that you use to make jewelry are so detail-oriented, and I am maybe not that detail-oriented as a person, so I was always, like my process was always fighting the very great skill that is required for that art form. And so I went home for half a semester, and then I came back and I switched into the only class that was available in the summer, which was a painting class. And of course, painting, it's a lot more free in many ways. And so I started painting. My brother Mark, whose work is in Sakkijajuk, will see his work. He started painting at the same time. He switched over. He transferred from UNB from a history program and came to NASCAD at the same time as me, coincidentally. And then we took painting together, and then we were in classes together, and like kind of sibling rivalry over the next 2 years until we graduated. So I did a painting and drawing degree. And I'm drinking coffee, I'm wearing a white shirt. I don't know how that's going to go. Or like past actions inform me that I'm probably going to have coffee on my shirt before the end of this talk. So at NASCAD, I was doing painting and drawing, and going into my last semester, the registrar contacted me and said, hey, did you know that you almost have a minor in art history? And if you take 2 more classes this coming semester, you'll have a major in painting and drawing and a minor in art history. And that turned out to be really critical to my career, and I'm ever grateful to that registrar, who I don't even know who they were. But they were very helpful to me because it helped me to get into an art history program later. So I graduated in the spring, and I was going to take a year and work in order to save enough money to do a master's degree, do an MFA. And I was working at a TGI Fridays at the casino in Nova Scotia at the time. It's 2004. And I was working there this summer. The end of the summer was when Hurricane Juan hit the East Coast, and it was really devastating. The whole city was flooded. We were without power for 5 weeks in some places. It was crazy. Like all the propane had sold out in the city. But on the night after the hurricane had hit, a dear friend of mine lived on a block where the nurse's residence was. And so he had his power restored on the very first day. People that lived across the street from him didn't get their power for 4 weeks. They hated him, obviously. The police once came and said, "Can you please stop flaunting your power? You're getting noise complaints, but they're really just power complaints." Anyway, so that evening we went to, there was only one beer store open in the city. The lineup was like literally 3 streets long. And I bought a 6-pack of Grasshopper, and my friends got a few beers, and we went back to their place and we played the game of life. And we played 2 rounds, and we played it until about 2 o'clock in the morning. Not even that late, maybe 1 a.m. And then our other friend came over to pick up we'd all had a few beers, so another friend came over to pick up my friend Cedric's car and then was going to drive us all home. But the power was out all over the city. So we got up to a intersection, and there was a blind hill, and we were really concerned that a car was going to come over the blind hill and hit us. So we were going very slowly, and all of our attention was kind of focused this way. And a car sped through the red light on the other side that wasn't on and hit us and T-boned us, and we flipped around and hit a light post. And I was on the side that hit the light post. My friend in the middle of the seat of the car had to be taken away in an ambulance. She had a chip in her spine. She was off work for 3 months. I was checked out by the paramedics. They said I looked fine, and my boyfriend and I walked home. And in the morning I woke up, and I always say, it was a little bit like I'd had a stroke. I had black and blue bruises all down the left side of my body, and I could not move my neck. Like, I didn't have this much motion. My arm had no strength in it. I couldn't lift it. I was, it was really devastating, and especially because I must have been in shock at the time, and it didn't hit me until then. So I started going to see physiotherapy. First it was, they put the gel on you and they just do the ultrasound thing, and very little was happening. And then I had acupuncture, and then I spent 12 months total I was in rehab. 10 months of that was just like lifting a beanbag, and then like pushing a milk crate with a beanbag in it. And then I got up to 2 beanbags, like pedaling a thing like this with my hand. So the point of the story is that I couldn't sleep, I couldn't sit, and I couldn't stand comfortably for more than about 25, 30 minutes in any position. And I didn't know if I would ever regain strength in my left arm. It was very slow progress, and I certainly wasn't going to be a painter. I'm a left-handed person. I still have pain in my shoulder to this day. That was, 12 years ago. And so in the meantime, I thought, well, I'll look up some MA programs in the meantime and see if there's something I can do while I wait to recover enough to go back into an MFA. And I Googled Inuit Art History University. Something, it was like, I probably binged it, or like, I asked Jeeves. and Carleton University came up. And I was very unsophisticated in Indigenous art. At NSCAD, I had started working on Inuit themes in my own work, but there was no faculty support for it at the time. I remember recalling asking some of the faculty, why don't we do any Indigenous art? And they just said, we haven't had a lot of success with this before, so we just don't do it, And if there are any art students here or former art students, that the critiques can be very difficult when you're the only Indigenous person in the room. It can be a real challenge to kind of speak and want to get into nuance when everyone else has stereotypical ideas of what your work should be or what it is that you're doing. So it was a real challenge. And so I didn't know anything about being a university student, really. I knew about being an art school student. And so I applied to Carleton because I had read that there had been Inuit art courses there. And of course, when I got there, I realized that those courses had been taught by George Swinton in the 1980s. And they hadn't really been taught in a consistent way ever since then. But I realized that there was actually a collection at the Carleton University Art Gallery, and a really great curator who's now the director, Sandra Dick, who was invested in seeing the Inuit art collection come to life there. And so she offered me a research assistantship in my first year that turned into a curatorial placement, which gave me my first introduction to curatorial practice. I also started working with Ruth Phillips. I hadn't even heard of her name before that time, which is, deeply embarrassing for me because she's such an important person in the field of Indigenous art, and I hadn't read any of this material before going to university. So it was a really steep learning curve for me in my first year. My really lovely colleagues all had art history degrees, and I had taken, Egyptian art and television criticism, and I just had a minor, and it was kind of just whatever sounded cool to me at the time. So I didn't have a canonical kind of instruction in that. And so it was a really steep learning curve for me, and many times I thought I would leave the program or that I wasn't good enough to be there. Now I'm like, I don't feel as emotional about it as I may be sounding right now. But it was a really challenging first year. But with a lot of university, if you stick with it, you get more and more independence on what you're studying, and then you get to design your way a little bit more and a little bit more. So I didn't have art historian or curatorial ambitions, but what I wanted to do for my master's thesis was just to write about a couple of Labrador Inuit artists, because I knew who the famous ones were. And everyone I knew in Labrador had some kind of an artistic practice, or was a builder, or like did things and had lots of art in their homes. And when I started looking for the research so I could write about, 2 or 3 sculptors in comparison, there was nothing. There was a handful of articles post-1949 about Labrador Inuit artists, and I mean 3 or 4. A couple of things about pre-contact or early contact ivory miniatures. There's a lot of those from Labradoran collections. No books. Few mentions in survey texts of Inuit art. In some books, they would just say, and nothing ever happened in Labrador, or they would be dismissive if they mentioned it. Wasn't included in any of the survey texts, and certainly not Labrador Inuit artists in exhibitions. And so I realized that I could not do this in a 80-page master's thesis, that it actually had to be a doctoral research because there was no research for me to start from. And so that's why I did a PhD. I realized that I needed to do something smaller for my MA and make something manageable that I could do so I could go straight into this research. And so I'll show you a little bit about it, but basically, over the course of my PhD, I started going back to Nunatsiavut. I can go back to those slides. I started going back to Nunatsiavut. There are 5 communities. So the green zone is our national park. It's the only Inuit-directed national park, all Inuit board in Canada. And then the yellow area is our settlement region. Our program is called Our Footprints Are Everywhere. That's the land claims document from the 1970s that led to our independence. We're the only Inuit self-governing territory. We have a relationship with the federal government. The red communities are where people currently live. That's in Labrador Inuit lands. And there are 5 communities in the territory, but where I grew up, Happy Valley Goose Bay has a very high Inuit population, as does Northwest River and Cartwright. They also have Inuk First Nation and Nunatsiavut, and then lots of settlers as well. So I grew up in a very multicultural kind of a place. So I started going back to the communities. I got some funding, and I had a little position that allowed me to do a bit of travel, and then I got some SSHRC funding, and I went home and I started doing interviews with artists. And what came out of that, my doctoral research, it had to bring together voices of artists. I interviewed about 60 artists for my work over a period of 3 years. And then I also pieced together archival material and looked at studies that had been done, and then ethnographic studies and anthropological studies and so on. And so that was the writing part of my project. This is normally where I would go to notes, but I'm going to backtrack now. So now I'm going to start talking about Sakkijajuk and what happened in Labrador. So although there is a very vast and critical literature on Inuit art in Canada, very, very little of that, as I've just said, comes from or centers on Labrador. And this is funny because really in the history of Inuit art, post-1949 to the present, what we think of as the beginning of the modern Inuit art movement to now, what's really funny about that is that Labrador Inuit art has been kind of dismissed as being too acculturated or inauthentic or not interesting. And it's very interesting to me because really the history of Labrador Inuit people since the last ice age receded and Inuit moved into the territory has been fascinating. We've had contact with Vikings 1,000 years ago, and Basque, Dutch, French, Spanish, British, anthropologists, ethnographers, people from Greenland, other Inuit populations. We've actually have a very rich history, and all of that is written into the record up until 1949, and then it just kind of drops off, and then Labrador is not included at all in the Inuit art history that we think of as this kind of canonical history. And so that was the question, that was my main research question with my doctoral research, is why is that? Why have we been left out when we have this very rich history up to a certain point and then it ends? And what my research determined, and hold on, I've got other visual images for you. So this is probably the first painting of a Labrador Inuit woman. This is Mikak from 1772. She was a young woman who was brought to Europe and met with dignitaries, and I think also King George, and talked to them about establishing missions in Labrador along the coast. So we were actually evangelized in the 1770s, which is much earlier than other parts of the more remote Arctic. People will often say that Labrador Inuit, one of the things that came out in the literature that I was reading was that people would say, well, Labrador Inuit have been evangelized for so long, they're no longer Labrador Inuit, they're Moravian Inuit, as if to say that by contact through religion or by setting and establishing settlements, that we somehow ceased to be, like we gave up our Inuitness. And like there are texts that they just stopped talking about Labrador after 1770, you know, like the moment of contact is the moment that Labrador Inuit stopped being interesting. This is a photo from about 130 years later than that, and I like to put these side by side when I'm teaching, because you can see that even though this is a woman from 130 years post-contact, she still clearly looks very much like the image in the painting. Her clothing, more importantly, is also just as elaborate, if not more so. It appears to be even more detailed, the Amouti that she's wearing, than the image from the previous work, which I think really it contradicts this idea that we ceased to be Inuit when we became a contact people. And I like to use this coat. This one is from 1920, so a little bit later. It's a very similar style coat from Labrador. And you can see that, I don't know if you're all familiar with this garment, but that is not applique on top of a garment. That is individual pieces cut out and sewn together. And so if you can imagine, this is the point where, like, as an art historian, I would walk over here and say, if you can imagine all of those individual lines on the back of this garment, the tail, you can see that it is all individual seams sewn together. And then you also have to think that this garment, like the one in 1770, that would have been sewn not with a needle and thread, but with bone and sinew. And sinew, first you have to hunt and kill a caribou, and then you have to skin it, and then you have to extract sinew from along their vertebrae. It's like a connective tissue that you have to make very fine, turn it into thread, and then you sew all these individual pieces together. And so there was no practical reason why you would do this to a garment. There's no reason why, like, you're living in the Arctic and you're like, let's put lots of seams in this garment. I think it's, you know, it is a testament to the skill of the artist, their desire to make things beautiful, their wanting to convey how talented they are, how much they love the person that they are giving the coat to talk about passing on the traditions that are sewn in their families and their communities, to differentiate from one community style to another. Like, it's all very complex and it's significant to the artist, and you can tell this is artistry. You know, this is done with great intent. And so, for me, talking about Labrador, I see very clearly that there has been this very continuous, unbroken, through clothing, through other kinds of things, an artistic work. Like, I have other slides that go back to, like, ivory, archaeological material, and so on. And it's beautiful. And it takes us right up to this time, 1949. And so what I was going to say was, so what I found out in my research was that the reason that Labrador Inuit suddenly took on a different respect in Inuit art actually has nothing to do with the art itself. What happened was that the same year that James Houston traveled throughout the Arctic, started traveling throughout the Arctic, and beginning what became the modern Inuit art industry, and I can go back and tell this story, that same year was the year that Newfoundland and Labrador joined Confederation. And so in 1949, when Houston first started this industry, he would travel throughout the Arctic. He would bring, here you can see he's got a suitcase full of sculptures and basketry and little handmade goods, and he's going from community to community and encouraging people to start working in the arts industry, which was really important economically at the time because it was the same time that the fur trade was declining. It's just after the Great Depression. And so he is traveling throughout what is now Nunavut and Nunavik, then the Northwest Territories and Arctic Quebec, and really starting an arts industry, which then led to the development of art studios, which led to the development of cooperatives, which Inuit joined boards and started to have control over. Those cooperatives grew to involve many other industries and have actually changed. The people that were on those early boards, many of them went on to become politicians and lead to cultural and political revolution for Inuit. So those little arts, those first art movements, that has had really broad-ranging effects for Inuit throughout Nunavut and Nunavik. But that was the year that Newfoundland and Labrador joined Confederation. And the first version of the Terms of Union had all the same provisions as everywhere else in Canada. The Indian Act for First Nations people, that Inuit would be the responsibility of the federal government, which was then under the Department of Mines and Resources. That was all in the first version. And in the final version, the Terms of Union, they just took it all out. Like dramatic pause. They took it all out. There is no mention of Indigenous peoples at all in the Terms of Union. Scholars have theorized that this might have been a strategy that was going to start with Newfoundland, and that the government had hoped to use this as a way to see if they could dispossess other provinces of their responsibilities and treaty rights and so on to other Indigenous peoples. Whatever the case is, it's not in the archival record, at least not that anyone's found. But the results have been kind of disastrous for Indigenous peoples in the province, as you may well imagine. The Halapu First Nation, you might have heard about them in recent years. They're a landless First Nation that is Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland, basically on the eastern side of Newfoundland. We know what happened with the Beothuk on the western side of Newfoundland. Or no, the eastern side, Mi'kmaq are on the western side. They could not get independence. They have had an association since the 1970s. They only, like 4 years ago, got the rights from the federal government to start an enrollment process to start a landless band. They thought they would get 10,000 applications. They had more than 200,000 applications of people saying, I have Mi'kmaq ancestry. So that's been a hugely problematic thing that's happening right now for the Newfoundland side. And in Labrador, we were not covered under the federal government. Well, the federal government spent 3 decades funding, promoting, marketing, sending instructors, building infrastructure, providing resources, sending materials, sending international Inuit art shows all over the world. And so when that Inuit art history that I talk about was being formed, it was being formed in the absence of Labrador, and also largely the absence of the Inuvialuit on the western coast as well. They have a different but not dissimilar history. I don't want to talk about this. We'll talk about this. So I went to, so when I started going back to Labrador to do the research, one of the first resources that I found that was really groundbreaking was that in the 1990s, so quite late in the game, the Inuit Art Foundation got involved in what was happening in Labrador and said, you know what, there actually are lots of Labrador Inuit artists and we should be including them in our as a national service organization for Inuit art. And so they hired an artist named Dinah Anderson, who is in the show. She traveled throughout Labrador over a period of, I think, 1 summer or 2 summers and interviewed something like 180 artists. Here's some other works. She took all kinds of Polaroid or black and white film, took pictures of artists. Claire Ford is I can't remember what community she's from. I won't say. Anyway, all these amazing artists did this with 180 artists, did artist biographies, had questionnaires and filled it all out with them, and really was really significant to getting them involved in Inuit art history. It wasn't until 1991 that Labrador Inuit were allowed to use the igloo tag. This is a piece that authenticates, you can see the earlier version, Eskimo art on the one side, and then the new tag that will be trademarked soon for Inuit art on the other side. This is something that licensees across Canada use to really validate and include Inuit artists, so we weren't allowed to use it in Labrador. It wasn't until 1991. This had been around since the 1960s. So you think about 30 years of not being authenticated, literally, as being real Inuit artists. Gilbert Hay, who is an elder that will hopefully be visiting, will be at the opening in the spring. He said in an Inuit Art Quarterly, one of the few articles about Labrador Inuit, he said, oh, I guess I'm a real Inuk artist now, in response to being accepted to that. The other parts of the history is that there was, of course, a lot of efforts to independently start arts movements in Labrador. This is a roundhouse. The article that this is written about in I can't read her name, Dory Cornelson's article about this in Inuit Art Quarterly issue said that the roundhouse was built 1 year, and then because of poor insulation, the roof collapsed the next year, and then that was it for the craft center in Nain. There's a Labrador Craft Producers Association that was formed and then had to fold because it was largely run by volunteers. You know, anything, they would get a little bit of startup money and then they would have to close their doors again. There were some initiatives to bring artists into contact with other crafts fair. This is a group of Nunatsiavut women going to a craft fair in I think they're headed to Ottawa. And this is my grandmother Susie. Remember how petite she is. That's going to come up again later. She was almost unilingual, didn't speak almost any English at all. This is us flying to, this is the planes. This is just for fun because I want you to feel what it's like to go and do research in Labrador. You're flying in a VW bus. One time I was supposed to be on a flight and then I changed it to the next day, and the flight that I was supposed to be on, I heard on the news that one of the windows had popped out, and so they had to go back and land again, and just like, no, window popped out, so we're gonna go back. You know, like, we're not gonna make you hold that in your lap. So I did my doctoral research, and I had to write about this history of absences and being overlooked and having initiatives fail under the weight of how difficult it is to have volunteers who are also artists, also run an arts organization. So it was really important work, but it was not. It wasn't where I wanted to end it. And so when I started teaching, I'm very grateful to have been given an opportunity through Anna Hudson's Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage SSHRC Partnership Grant, because she said to me, Heather, do you want to be a partner? And I reviewed the grant, and I said, you know, again, it's very Nunavut and Nunavik heavy, and what about Inuvialuit and about Nunatsiavut? And she said, you're absolutely right, and, you know, name a budget figure and we're going to make this project happen. What do you want to do? And I said, I don't actually want to determine what to do. I want to talk to artists about what they would like to do, because I know they know and they just don't have the resources. It's not, you know, I'm not the first person to go to Labrador and try to get something started, or to be from there and try to get something started. So we started going back. We did several consultation visits. The total number of trips over the research and development phase, which was paid for by the SSHRC grant, was I want to say 35, like really, really expensive, if you can imagine. The Canadian Arctic is probably the most expensive place on Earth to fly to. And we would go to each community, and I would just get on the radio in the morning and say, hey, come on down, tea and cookies. Tell us about what you would like to see in the arts. And people would come in, and at first there was a lot of like, where are you publishing this report? And then I would say, it's not a report, we don't know what it is. And so, like, come in and you tell us. And so we started with questions like, you know, what are the challenges that you experience, but also like, what are the challenges to you making the best work? Do you make what you want to work, or do you feel like you're beholden to the really limited market here? What is it like to get materials? Because of course there are no art supply stores in Labrador. There's not even really like a coffee shop that you could put your work up in and have a little show. There is a cultural center there, but it has probably a space about this big, which is the not permanent gallery. And up until a couple of years ago, because it's all housed under the same provincial art gallery, that gallery in Labrador would take mostly shows from Newfoundland. So they were showing Newfoundland art in the only place to show Labrador art in Labrador. So when the new director, Vicky Cheney-Gagnon, came on, she came to some of the consultation meetings, and that was what some of the artists said. And so she actually changed that process and said, well, we're going to send you some Labrador stuff from our collections. But nonetheless, so there's a lot of challenges to getting an art history going here. Started going to Labrador, did a bunch of consultations, determined that artists, I'm going to go a little bit fast now because I want you to actually see the work, determined that artists had very poor access to materials, couldn't afford to buy in bulk, and so they did not get the best quality things. And then I asked them, you know, if you could make something to the best of your ability, to the height of your imagination, with the best qualities, where money's no object and time is no object, what would you make? Like, within reason, of course, not like 20 years and $1 million. And artists actually had lots of ideas about what they would make if they didn't have to make something for market, if they didn't have to worry about selling it or being out of pocket. And so we devised a kind of a order form for materials, and artists sat down with us. They came to some of these meetings, and we sat down and we listed everything they would need to make whatever they wanted. If it was an amouti, we were like, what about string? How many needles do you break when you're sewing something like this? What kind of, you know, do you need a different foot for your sewing machine? Are you going to do it by hand? What is that? Do you need a glove? You know, how many sealskins? We worked out everything. Artists were talking about making video art to paintings and drawings, stone sculpture. Something like 2,000 tons of stone. And we just bought everything in bulk and then sent it all to one clearinghouse. And so we saved a lot of money that way. We got sponsorship from some of the suppliers, spent I think the total was over $50,000. I know the first time we gave away $31,000 worth of materials, and then we did a second round because some people were sad that they hadn't understood the first opportunity, and then they saw that other people were like getting all this stuff, and they were like, actually, I would like to take part in that too. We gave them all the materials for free, and we did not say you have to make something for the show with this. We said if you can, we'll be back in 8 months, and if you know what I mean. But we're not going to like come banging on doors and say, "Where's my sealskin boots?" You know. We did an oral history project at the same time. If I don't run out of time, I'll show you a little clip of this. This is one of our fabulous RAs now doing a PhD. Inuk is a animation artist. She just did a film with the NFB, and that's her grandfather, Gilbert. I've been talking about him. He's the one that is sort of sarcastically responding to Igloo Tag. He's great. And when Echo was a little baby, he prophesied that she was going to be a great artist and travel the world, and now she is. We did a special issue of Inuit Art Quarterly. It's the first one that ever sold out, which was great because in the previous 25 years, there probably hadn't been enough articles on Labrador to fill a whole issue. We have a trilingual catalog. The government of Nunatsiavut, who became really important partners, organized a series of workshops leading up to and around the exhibition because there was such a regeneration of excitement. One of them was hand tools with Billy Gauthier. They sent a group of aspiring jewelers to Igloliorte, to Matthew Nikinga's studio where they received training. We organized that. We said, you know, if we're getting all these artists together for an opening, we might as well have a conference. And so we organized with Arts NL, the province's first ever Indigenous arts conference, including performing arts as well as visual artists. It was amazing. And then we did a community show. We took over the artists had said that they had no idea what people were doing from community to community because it's so expensive to travel together. And so there is, like I said, there's no venue to take over to do it. So we took over the Kinsman and Kinnett Center, and then we got the high school pipe and drape, but the black was being used by the Lions Club, so we had to go with the blue. and we had the amazing person who manages the Kinsman Center built us temporary walls. We put up a show for just 5 days. We said to the artists, you can sell anything, that anyone can buy it, but if we select it for the touring exhibition, you both have to agree to loan it to us, you know? So 100% of the funds went to the artists who wanted to sell work. We did $12,000 in sales in Labrador in 5 days. I was also like heavily pushing things on Facebook, to be super fair. But we brought to Labrador, you know, it was a little bit of a, you know, like if we do this in Labrador and people from all over the country don't see it, then what is the impact? And so we brought curators, art historians, collectors, private gallerists, writers from across the country. We had about a dozen people come in and attend speak at the arts conference and participate in the show. Everybody bought something. Here we are installing the work with Nellie Winters, amazing, probably the most respected artist, and grandmother and great-grandmother to several other generations of artists in Labrador. And then we opened the exhibition at the Rooms the following year. So I selected about 25 pieces from the community show, some of whom by artists who had never shown their work publicly before. And 25 of those works came on to join another 62 pieces from collections across Canada, largely the Rooms, also Indigenous and Northern Affairs. So we had a number of major collectors, as well as some private collectors and so on that loaned us works. The opening installation is called Our Footprints Are Everywhere. It's based on our land claim agreement, and it's a pair of boots made by women or a woman from each of the communities, including, so you can see here a little bit closer in detail. You can see this on our website, Sakkijajuk.com. The piece in the front here is, one set is by Andrea Flowers, those are made with traditionally tanned sealskin. She's one of the last women who does it on a regular basis. And then in front of, I know it's not a great image, but in front of her boots are her granddaughter's baby booties that she also made. Those were Vanessa's first piece to ever show publicly. We had Inuit clothing. On the far left is the jacket made by my grandmother. Remember, I showed you a picture of her. She's quite petite. That's an adult's very small jacket. Done in Inuk designs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then we had a sealskin coat, but also in a very contemporary cut by Sophie Pomack. And then in the center is a traditional lamauti, but it is woven entirely by materials that Chantal wove herself. So she did a textile program in St. John's and then wove every part of it, sewed it, and assembled it all together. It's gorgeous. The exhibition, because in Labrador, we have, because there's so many generations of artists that we are showing concurrently, not all of the artists are still living. It's 47 artists in total in this show. But because there were elders working today as well as elders working 30 years ago, and this is a community-based show that's really comprehensive, or attempts to be, it didn't make sense to organize things by chronology or by when they were made, and so instead I organized the exhibition around generations of artists, because elders' work would then be shown together even though it might have been made several decades apart. So these are drawings by Josephine Callio, who I won't talk about every artist in detail, but she didn't draw her whole life, and then she had a job doing oral history transcription for the local radio station, and she transcribed another elder's stories and became so inspired that she did a series of about 40 drawings, and then that was it. And they're amazing. We did a big installation. There's a smaller one touring. Grass work is also very important in Labrador. Here we have works by Garmel Rich, who works in these traditional kind of basket forms, but she also made a Stanley Cup one time. Her son would not loan it to the exhibition. He was like, I tried. I don't blame him. Josephine Jacques made this amazing open work vase. This is one of the pieces that was selected for the show. This is a full-scale rifle case by George Rich in the exhibition, loaned to us by Montreal University. This is a basket. There's also a lot of really beautiful sealskin and fox fur clothing and items in the show. These are my father's pattern. They're actually these huge, gorgeous red gauntlet mittens. You have to see them in person to really understand how beautiful they are. Again, sort of more traditional doll styles that you might still find in craft shops there today, as well as some more, not more imaginative, but maybe more fanciful pieces, like this one by Emily Flowers. This is a little tiny embroidery. It's about this big, and it's just the most amazing thing. It's all the same color of blue thread, and so it's really just a master embroiderer who's like working in all different directions. We have a photographer, Uncle Jim James Anderson, whose work we actually matched his photos to his slides so that you can see the artist's hand on his pieces. Now I got to go real fast. Here's an installation shot from the rooms. This is Michael Massey's work. He's going to be coming, so you can hear him talk about his own stuff. Wall hangings by Shirley Morehouse, who works like other Inuit artists, but in the wall hanging medium, which is quite popular, but she uses found media and pieces that are, offcuts from making mittens and so on, and she takes caribou skin and all these dyed pieces and puts them together in mixed media kind of a way. Early printmaking. This is Dinah Anderson's sculpture work. She's also a printmaker as well. John Teriak. And then we move into another generation of artists who are working in contemporary photography media. It's work by Michelle Bakey, who started off as she was studying ophthalmological imaging and got really interested in the eye. And I always say to my students, I'm like, this was made in the 90s. It was not done on Photoshop. It was like done very painstakingly. This work by my brother Mark, who's a painter. He stayed in painting, and I did not. Billy Gauthier, who I showed giving the demonstration, he's just a really incredible and prolific sculptor. This piece, you can actually see tears on her face. Heather Campbell's work, 7th Generation Inuit Community, where she's projecting Inuit into the future. Works in Anorthosite, which is that stone only appears in Labrador. Elias Semyuk, Jason Jack's mixed media work. Ryan Winters, another artist that had never shown publicly. This was on the back cover at Inuit Art Quarterly. He's like showing all over the place. This is from his work on a crab boat in some season, and he was like, I almost died taking this photo. Jenny Williams, who I think will also be here. This is her Iook Night series. I encourage you to Google that. These photos are terrifying. It's a long tradition, Moravian and Inuit mixed. Some of the artists in the show took on more daring subject matter and was interested in political and social critique. This is a work called Residential School Nightmare by David Iook. It is another piece that it's so shiny that it doesn't really photograph well. You have to come in and see it and also feel its power in person. This works by Jacko Pioji, a young man who died by suicide while we were in the process of doing this exhibition. So these pieces I met him and we were going to interview him, and he's just, it's in the show because this is something that is a crisis in our communities, and he's such a talented young man. And then the show ends with this work by Inez Shaiwak, who is youth, who is talking about elders, and so the exhibition sort of starts with elders and moves you around, and you come back to the youth actually comes back around and understands how youth are connected to elders. So I only have a minute left, and so I'm just going to end by letting the artists have the last word here, as I just did in Toronto.
I never get tired of it. I can, if I wouldn't get sleepy, I can sew all night and day.
Back in the day when we were growing up, if you wanted a toy, there was no toys to buy, or you didn't have money to buy, and so if you wanted something, you made something.
I'm lucky enough that for the most part, I get to create whatever it is I feel like. So, and that's the best part of the job, just doing whatever it is I want.
So I think for me, it's people understanding the beauty that's in Labrador. I think that's important for me to sort of try and portray, whether that's in people or whether that's in land. I've heard so much about the North is really barren, and that's really not the case at all.
Well, I learned to carve from mostly watching family members carve. Started with my dad. We used to do some wood carvings, just little kayaks, and he came home one day with stone and tools, and we went down from there.
And like in Nunatsiavut, we have life skills classes, so it was always the boys with the man, and then the girls went with the woman, and we did sewing. So I sewed different materials, but sealskin, it seems to be the thing that I want to keep doing, and people seem to be interested in wanting to buy.
Like I said earlier, I started working just in wood first, then I graduated into antler, then I graduated into ivy, then I graduated into soapstone, then to marble, then to every other type of stone you can name on the face of the earth. So that includes granite.
I feel like it's not so much doing the craft, but more coming over to Nan's and spending time with her, because I come over mostly every day. And it's just to talk with Nan and tell stories about her past, and just while we're talking, make a pair of slippers or make a doll, it's very relaxing.
I kind of like to do things that I haven't seen before. Yeah.
This is important, like getting our work out, to show that these are the experiences that created the people who we are today. Like these are the experiences that affected our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, our cousins, our nieces, our nephews. These are the situations that made me the person that I am today, and the people that they are today, and why they are creating what they are today, or if they're not creating.
I started carving when I was about 14 years old. I was always into drawing when I was in school. And one day, my dad and me and brother Dave went visiting up the road in Happy Valley. And I don't know who the guy was. We went in the house and we stayed there a while. And the guy we visited happened to have a schooner carved out of wood stuck on his wall. I don't know why, but he asked me, "Can you make that?" I looked at it. Sure, I'll try. So I went home and I carved one. Right up showed him how much same as one they had. And I've been carving ever since.
My grandfather on my mother's side made his living through house painting. And so there was always the material of paint in their basement. And so I think like the experiences of being there, and then that kind of vivid memory of my father painting the black diamond on the side of the komatik, that to me, like there's a real connection point between painting and culture.
You try and do your best all the time. For everything I do, I always try and put most energy in the best I can for each piece, sort of thing. If I'm not satisfied, it's not going outside the door. It doesn't travel.
And art is a great way to get people to kind of open up and start asking questions about Inuit and what it means to be Inuit.
All right, thank you. So I'm over my time, as usual. So Taima Nakami.